I debated all week long about whether or not to do what I'm about to do.
Does that mean you win or you lost?
Yeah, that's the question, and whether or not y'all can make that decision after it's all said and done. But it's at a certain about halfway through this, we're going way, way, way into the weeds. But I thought it would be something you would like to know about down the line. So when we get there, you'll know what I'm talking about. So getting back to the position of ultimately what the writer of the book of Hebrews is talking about, especially in the first half of the book, is Jesus's position. What Jesus is supposed to be to us, and we're settling into this region. In just the first chapter, we've got to look at all of these Old Testament references, and we at least got through the 5th verse last week. Not promising anything for this week because we're on verse 6 and we'll be there all day today and maybe after that. So to review verse 5, there are 2 quotations there that we went through. The first one is from Psalms 2. You are my son, today have I begotten you, speaking about his anointed and his king. This is an enthronement psalm, so it talks about the king of Israel being his anointed, his king, and him saying to the king, you are my son, today have I begotten you, but begotten not in a sense of birthed, but in a sense of an adoption. And then the other quotation is from 1 Samuel 7 and from the book of Chronicles, but this one in particular speaks of, I will be to him a father, he shall be to me a son, speaking of the offspring of David, starting with Solomon, but also going to all of those after Solomon, because your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. So again, this is a reference that initially in the Old Testament is to the king of Israel. So in both of these cases, it's God declaring himself to be the father of the king. The king is his son, and the promises that come with that. So there's a Christological declaration there that Jesus is the Messiah, and the Messiah is what? The King of Israel, and the King of Israel is the Son of God. But Jesus is a little different than all the other kings of Israel. And that's where he's going in this book. This I didn't point out last week. This quotation from 1 Samuel is a quotation about Solomon and the other sons of David that come after Solomon. And the issue here is that in the book of Hebrews, he's using this verse as to speak of Jesus. So he starts off with Psalm 2 and says, you are my son, today I've begotten you. And he comes to here and he says, I will be to him a father, he shall be to me a son. Again. But the problem with quoting that verse is what comes right after that verse. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men. That doesn't apply to Jesus. Not if we believe that Jesus never committed iniquity. So this is a problem that you run into when you start applying these Old Testament verses in the New Testament. And it's an interesting problem that you run into, how they are picking these pieces out of the Old Testament and applying them. Because sometimes you run into problems like this. That's one of the things we're going to look at today. How does the Old Testament get used? And when is it appropriate to pull things out like this and apply them to Jesus? There was an example of this last week as we were getting done. We got to verse 6, and in verse 6 he says, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him. I left you with a challenge in that He brings the firstborn into the world, first of all. And we saw in the third and fourth verse where he was talking about everything that was made through Christ. And yet the angels are there to worship him when he comes into the world. So if he created the angels, how is this possible? Now there's an out for this. So now I'm going to give you the out. Do you ever remember a time when Jesus came into the world and the angels worshiped him? When? When he was born. Very good. So, this will be a sign to you, find a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes lying in a manger. Suddenly there was an angel, a multitude of angels of the heavenly host, praising God and saying, Glory to God in the highest, on earth peace among those with whom he is pleased. You can use that verse there, and it solves that problem. Is this what the writer of the book of Hebrews had in mind? Probably not, in my opinion, but that's okay. Because, and this is where we're kind of drifting with this whole discussion about the Old Testament and the New Testament, is that sometimes the writers of the scriptures are writing something that is completely different from its future meaning. Because in Psalm 2, they weren't writing about Jesus. Psalm 2, they were writing about the king of Israel. The quotation from Samuel, same thing. Nathan was not referring to a future Messiah who would be the king of everything. He was only referring to the Messiahs that would come after David, the ones that were sitting on the earthly throne of Israel. Here we have another example. Maybe the writer of the book of Hebrews didn't have this in mind, but it applied. We're going to drift off into the weeds here with some of this. So y'all just bear with me, and I'll try to keep it organized so that you can follow all of this. If you have a reference Bible, a Bible that points you to other verses from a verse, here is the one that I have and the example. So in this verse 6, and again when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, let all God's angels worship him. So at some point, there's a quotation that where God says, let all the angels worship him. And there are two references given. If you have a reference Bible, you'll see that there are two references given. Deuteronomy 32:43 and Psalm 97:7. So we're going to look at both of those. Psalm 97 is the easy one. The heavens proclaim his righteousness, and all the peoples see his glory. This is speaking of God the Father. All worshippers of images, idol worshippers, are put to shame, who make their boast in worthless idols. Worship him, all you gods. If you're looking at the English Standard Version, this is what it says. Worship him, all you gods. You may see something different in other translations, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Zion hears and is glad, and the daughters of Judah rejoice because of your judgments, O Lord. For you, O Lord, are most high over all the earth. You are exalted far above all gods. If you look at what's actually in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Old Testament, this is what it says. Worship him, all you gods. That's not the quotation in Hebrews. What did the quotation in Hebrews say? Worship him, all you angels. So why, if this says worship him, all you gods, is the quotation in Hebrews from Psalm 97? As we talked about last week, there are places in the Old Testament where when they did the Septuagint, the translation from Hebrew to Greek, they changed the word Elohim to angelos, angel. Because, so here's a little bit of the weeds. Why did they do that? In the oldest part of the Old Testament, when Israel was first getting started, all the way up until the time that they went into Babylonian captivity, we like to think that Israel worshipped the only one and true God. And yet they were constantly being harassed by God. Why? Because they were worshiping other gods. Which means they were not monotheistic. They didn't believe there was only one God. That's the only explanation for that, right? If God constantly complained because they were worshiping other gods, then they didn't just believe in one God. They believed in a lot of gods. And when they wrote the Old Testament, they were writing it from that perspective. So their perspective was there's only one superior God, and that's our God. And all the other gods in the world have to bow down to our God because he's the superior God. And this is where I go back to what I talked about last week in Deuteronomy, where God created the nations and he gave every nation a God. That's what it says in Deuteronomy. And Elohim. But when they translated that into the Greek in the Septuagint, they changed that to angels. So every nation has an angel that is in charge of it. And in the book of Daniel, we see an example of that, which I'm not going to go into now, but that idea persisted. Every nation was overseen by an angel, which in the beginning was considered a god, and that's why all the other nations had their own god that they worshiped. So here we have the same idea. The literal Hebrew says all gods have to worship God the Father, Yahweh. But when they translated it into Greek, they changed it to angel. Because now, by that time, and that was around 250 BC, and we're going to see that, talk about that again in just a second. By that time, they were what we would call monotheistic. There's only one God. So this wasn't literally gods. These were spiritual beings, but not up to the level of what we now call God. So now let's take on the other one. So it's verse 43, but here's the context. See now that I, even I, am he, and there is no God beside me. I kill and make alive, I wound and heal, and there is none that can deliver out of my hand. I will make my arrows drunk with blood, and my sword shall devour flesh with the blood of the slain and the captives from the long-haired heads of the enemy. So here we have this military imagery, and God is superior to all of the enemies. Verse 43, rejoice with him, O heavens, bow down to him, all gods. Here we have Elohim again. For he avenges the blood of his children and makes vengeance on his adversaries. He repays those who hate him and cleanses his people's lands. So follow me here. The original says this, in essence. He says in verse 39, I am he, there is no God beside me. And yet still when you get to verse 43, what does it say? All gods, even though there's only him, all gods have to worship me. So here we have that same contrast that we're talking about. So the quotation in Hebrews is, he commands all his angels to worship when he comes in. Where's angels in this verse? Let me set this up. In the New Testament, the quotations that we see get put into the New Testament come from the Old Testament, but not from Hebrew. Because they were all familiar with the Septuagint. That's what they were looking at. They were writing in Greek, so we have to realize that if they're writing in Greek, they're not reading Hebrew. What are they reading? They're reading Greek. The Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. So they're quoting the Septuagint. And that's why we get angels in these places, because they're reading an Old Testament that doesn't say gods, doesn't say Elohim, it says angelos, angels, the Greek word. So the question that sets up is, We have a Hebrew version of the Old Testament that says one thing. And we have a Greek version of the Old Testament that the writers of the New Testament are reading and putting into what they're writing, that we eventually call Scripture, but they don't say the same thing. So which one is God's Word? Can't answer that question, but I'm giving you that question just so you'll have it in your pocket. Because to make this matter even worse, here's the Greek: worship him, all angels, God. So that's what Hebrews says. Worship him, all angels of God. Deuteronomy says worship, and you see they're the same word, same words, him, same word, all. This is different. Sons, God. So that's what it says in Deuteronomy. Worship him, sons of God. So if he's quoting straight out of the Septuagint, he didn't quote it straight out of Deuteronomy, because it says sons of God, not angels of God. He'd have to change it in his mind that a son of God is an angel of God. But he's been talking already about a son of God, and that wasn't an angel. He's actually arguing that this son of God is not an angel. He's superior to an angel. So maybe that's a jump we shouldn't make. In Psalm 97 it says, worship him, all the angels of him, referring to God. So the tense is different. Him, all the angels of him, of God. So this is the idea of this, but the words aren't exactly the same. Now we saw with the other quotations in verse 5, he's going straight from the Old Testament Septuagint. So here he's changed something somewhere. Maybe. Here's where the weeds get really high. The King James Version, what they translated the King James Version from, is what we're still more or less using today as the Old Testament, the Hebrew Old Testament. And that's something that's known as the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is the authoritative, in other words, it's the official version of the Old Testament. The authoritative Hebrew and Aramaic text. Aramaic is in there because Daniel and some other small parts are written in Aramaic, not Hebrew, of the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible. So that's the official Old Testament, and that's the one that we typically use today to come from Hebrew to our language. And that's what they used when they did the King James Version. It came about in the 7th century, roughly in the 7th century AD, in the 700s, 800s AD. So it's not nearly as old as the New Testament. The Masoretic Old Testament is newer than the New Testament. And what they did, there were these Jewish leaders known as the Masoretes. And they wanted to standardize the Old Testament. They wanted to do basically the same kind of thing that the Septuagint was, but they wanted to do it in Hebrew. They wanted to make an official version because there were slight differences out there and they wanted to get them all standardized. One of the reasons there were some differences is I've shown you before in Greek, in the Greek texts, there is no punctuation, there's no capitalization, there's no spaces between the words. If you get a collection of letters that look like a word, but there's a collection of letters on this side and on this side that if you split this other collection in the middle, it makes two different words. You have to figure out where the word starts and ends because there's not a space. So Hebrew was the same way. And Hebrew didn't have vowels. When they wrote Hebrew, they didn't have vowels that they stuck in. So everything was just a consonant. Now, you can't say just a bunch of consonants. You could have a Hebrew word with written down with no consonants, and it could be 4 or 5 different words because the vowels make it a different word. When you say Hebrew, there's no problem. When you're speaking Hebrew, everybody knows what you mean because you say it with the vowels in it. But when you write it down, you don't put the vowels in. This is a problem. They needed to fix that problem. And during this time, before this time, they developed these extra marks that they would put into the Hebrew when they wrote it down that were not vowels in the sense that we have a letter that they put in, but they just marked it so that the sound you're supposed to make here is this sound. It's in essence a vowel. So the Masoretes put vowels in essence, so you could read it and know which word it was supposed to be. So that's one of the things that they did here, and did the other things that they needed to do to make it clear. So there's an official Hebrew version. That's what they made the King James Version from. And the oldest one of these that we have any fragments of is from the 900s. The oldest complete Old Testament that we have is from the 1100s. So this verse that we're looking at, Deuteronomy 32:43, the oldest Masoretic version of that we have is from the 1100s. So all this stuff we're looking at in the New Testament is way older than that. And that's what they made. That's what we typically use as the official Bible. We talked about the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It was done 250 BC, before Christ. So it's nearly 1,000 years or so older than the official Hebrew Bible that we don't have until actually 1100, which is 400 years after that. So technically, this is actually older than this by far. So whatever they used here was an 1100-year-old version of the Hebrew Bible that we don't have. Except we kind of do now. Because in the 1940s and 50s, they were pulling the Dead Sea Scrolls out. They found those. And there are lots of Old Testament books in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There are 33, I think that's the right number, pieces of Deuteronomy in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This particular one, 4Q44, is the only one that has Deuteronomy 32:43 in it. And that lets us know that the Septuagint, has a different version than this of Deuteronomy 32:43. The Septuagint is a little different. Okay, so here's what we have. This is how a Bible today looks. The ESV, which we read a minute ago, rejoice with him, O ye heavens, bow down to him, all gods, for he avenges the blood. The NET, cry out, O nations, with his people, for he will avenge his servants' blood. King James kind of follows that. Rejoice, O ye nations, with his people, for he will avenge the blood of his servants. These are all coming from the Masoretic text. All three of these. But even then, you see there's some pretty significant difference in the way they're translating it. We're looking for let all God's angels worship him. And nobody really gets to let all God's angels worship him. Not with what we have. Here's the Septuagint version that is also in 44Q4, if I'm remembering that right, of the Dead Sea Scroll version of Deuteronomy. Rejoice ye heavens, let him and let all the sons of God, so that's where sons of God comes from, worship him. So just like in Psalms, we got sons of God here, but it goes on, rejoice ye Gentiles with his people, and let all the angels of God strengthen themselves in him, for he will avenge the blood of his sons, and he will render vengeance and recompense justice to his enemies, and will reward them that hate him, and the Lord shall purge the land of his people. This is a much larger verse than what eventually made it into the Masoretic text. And you see there's two mentions here, one of the sons of God worshiping and another of the angels of God strengthening themselves. There are versions of the Septuagint that exist that actually have this reversed, so that this first line says, let all the angels of God worship him, and let all the sons of God strengthen themselves. Because ultimately the writer was just flipping the context there, but saying the same thing. So here we actually do have a pretty close match to what the writer of the book of Hebrews was quoting. Let the angels of God worship him. Most likely that this is where the writer of the book of Hebrews got this. Not necessarily from Psalms, but from here. Because the verb tense matches, the order of the words match, all that. This kind of emphasizes we have the Old Testament that they found at Qumran with the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have the Masoretic text, which is what the Jews decided that the Old Testament was supposed to say in 700. We have the Septuagint, which translated whatever existed when they translated the Septuagint into Greek in 250 or thereabouts. And then we have all the English versions, which say various things. Which one is right? So this is the problem that we end up with, which is why we always answer these questions exactly the same way. That we're not looking at this from a position of fact. We're not looking at this from a position of logic. Because if you do that, you should just quit and go home. So this all comes down to faith. The funny part about all of this is the Bible actually says this out loud and we ignore it. We don't believe on fact. And we're going to get to that in chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews. We don't believe because of facts. We believe because of faith. If you try to, and this is the irritating part to this with me, is all you ever see on the internet or anywhere else in pulpits are people trying to prove facts. If you ever only get one thing out of my whole class that I've ever done in my life, get that. You can't win an argument about the scripture on facts. You will lose. Because it's got facts in it that will do nothing but confuse you. But it is full of one thing that won't confuse you. Faith. We're going to pick it up here next week, but ultimately we already are 6 verses in, and this question, he's in the first 6 verses, he's answered this question. The rest of this that we're going to go through is just going to be building on his foundation here, but he's already answered his question, and we'll pick it up there next week.